All right, welcome everyone to U.S. History 1302. We're going to try today to finish our lesson about the Gilded Age, okay? So, last week we were learning about factories, okay, and working conditions in factories, and we talked about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, where like a few hundred, I think it was like 130 or so women died because there was no safety. There was no safety features in the factory. There was no fire escapes, and there were all these practices being done to maximize the labor, which ended up making it much less safe. Okay, and so many workers don't like the conditions that they deal with. The average worker is working for very, very low wages. They're working very long hours, like 10 to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. There's really no safety net. There's no unemployment insurance. There's no minimum wage. There's no workers' compensation. And so how are workers ever going to see anything get better? All the power is in the hands of the business owners. They're the ones that own the factories. They're the ones with the money. How can workers make any change? Well, the answer lies in something called unions. Okay? So, unions organize. I don't know if this is still. Stop. Go away. There. All right. The unions organize. All right. Labor unions are groups of workers organized together to fight for better wages and conditions. Okay? Or labor unions are groups of workers collectively organized together to bargain for better wages and better conditions. Okay? If one worker goes up to his boss and asks for a raise, he's going to get fired. But if every worker in the factory asks for a raise, it's a lot harder for the boss to fire everyone. Okay? There is strength in numbers, and workers realize that they outnumber managers. And there are more workers than there are managers. Okay? And so labor unions across America start to organize. Now, there have been early unions even before the Civil War. Okay? Skilled craft workers, carpenters, iron molders, cigar makers joined together to protect themselves against the growing power of management. Okay? Railroad brotherhoods also worked to furnish insurance for those hurt or killed on the accident-plagued railroad lines. But most of these early labor unions are largely local and almost all exclusively male. And so your one particular site where you work at might have a labor union, but there is no national labor unions until the Gilded Age, okay? One of the earliest groups of workers to form a national union was called the National Labor Union, okay? It worked to have lots and lots of skilled and unskilled workers together. And in the early 1870s, there's about 600,000 people that joined the National Labor Union. The National Labor Union, though, was not super successful, okay? They demanded the government change things. They demanded that the employers change things. They wanted an 8-hour workday, and that was probably their most popular demand, okay? The National Labor Unions, their cry was 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, and 8 hours for what you will. That's what they wanted. But the National Labor Union, the first one, really fell apart in 1873 during a period of economic depression when labor was less able to they weren't able to control the job market. You see, during times of economic growth, workers tend to have an advantage, okay? As the economy is growing and businesses are growing and they want to compete, they need more workers. And so the demand for labor goes up. And one thing that you need to understand about the economy is it all comes down to supply and demand. When the demand for a good is high and the supply for a good is low, the price for that good is high. Okay? When the demand for a good, though, is low and the supply is high, the price is also low. So, in an economic boom, when there's lots of people growing businesses and lots of people hiring workers, there is a high demand for workers but there's not that many unemployed workers to choose from. So that means that the price of labor is higher. Wages tend to go up when the economy is doing well. But when the economy goes bad and there's less work available, that means that there's less demand for jobs. And there's more unemployed people, which means the price for labor is very low. You don't have to charge people as much for your work, or rather, you don't have to pay your workers as much. And so in 1873, there is an economic depression that goes through the country, and it kind of wilts the National Labor Union. The National Labor Union was a big public union, and it had a lot of public demonstrations. A far more effective labor union at the time was a group called the Knights of Labor. The Knights of Labor was actually born as a secret organization. It was formed by Uriah Stevens in 1869 and 9 Philadelphia garment cutters. They founded the Noble and Holy Order of the Knights of Labor. So they had like a nice fancy name. Okay. They put themselves in ritual and regalia. They met in secret, and they were very strongly Protestant, and they worked to gather together a union of lots and lots of different people. Now in 1879, they ended up opening their ranks quite to basically everyone. And so what the Knights of Labor ends up creating is a very large labor union with lots of different varieties of skill and people, okay? So we look at labor unions, the Knights of Labor. If we look at their leader was Uriah Stevens. Their membership allowed for skilled and unskilled workers. Now, a skilled worker is someone who has a level of training that puts them above the average Joe walking off the street, okay? They have some training, they have some craft, they have some skill that provides them with a basis of getting a higher income. An unskilled worker is just someone you bring off the street that's typically doing manual labor. So like a welder is a skilled laborer, whereas someone who's just in the factory like sweeping the floors is unskilled labor, okay? Someone digging a ditch is unskilled labor. Someone who knows how to like craft, fine cloth is a skilled labor. And so like there's different levels of workers. Typically, skilled workers have the most prestige and respect in society, along with a higher income. Unskilled workers are seen to be like, the bottom rungs of society. And so the Knights of Labor was interesting in that it combined skilled and unskilled labor, okay? They wanted to have one big union to embrace the toiling millions of skilled and unskilled men and women and all races, okay? Men and women could join this union, and all races could join this union, okay? Which meant that it was much more diverse, much more open, but that also meant that it had a lot of division within itself, okay? The radical Knights of Labor wanted to change the United States, wanted to get better wages and conditions, and it wanted government reform. Their goal, the Knights of Labor's goal is not just to convince just one boss at a time to give them better wages and conditions, but their goal is government reform of the economy. They want the U.S. government to reform the economy. The things that they wanted reformed was they wanted things like better wage laws, better working conditions, safety, better working hours. Things like government ownership of railroads, government ownership of infrastructure. Basically, they wanted the government to start coming in and managing the economy to make it fair and better for workers, okay? The Knights of Labor, however, was divided by internal problems, okay? Because they let just everybody in, there is tension among the ranks between the skilled and the unskilled, between those that want women and those that don't, the people that intern like racism between white workers and other workers, etc. So the Knights of Labor was effective in making some changes, but ultimately it got lumped in with a bunch of extremists that I'm about to tell you about in a little bit with the Haymarket Square incident. So eventually the Knights of Labor fizzles out because they get labeled as extremists, because some people take it too far and they start blowing stuff up, okay? There's it's later on the PowerPoint, but essentially there's some people that get killed, the Knights of Labor gets blamed for it, and it kind of makes them fizzle out. The Knights of Labor doesn't get the things that they want during their heyday. The next labor union I want to talk about was a bit more effective, but had much more manageable goals. Okay, all right, here we go, the Great Upheaval. Let's talk about it first. So the Knights of Labor and other labor unions are getting started, and the Knights of Labor is not the only one. There's lots of different labor unions, especially for smaller businesses or particular industries, okay? The Great Upheaval is a massive, massive strike that happens in 1877, also known as the Great Railroad Strike. In 1877, America was in a deep economic depression, and the country's first nationwide strike happened as a result, okay? So railroads are critical to the economy. We've talked about this before. Railroads are like the lifeblood of the American economy, taking resources from the West, bringing them to the East, taking finished products from the East, bringing them to the West. They're like the veins of the body that carry the blood around our body. The railroads, they carry the lifeblood of America's economy around. And the workers on the railroads have formed a labor union in a response to the bad conditions and wages they have. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Company cut their workers' wages by 20%, okay? Imagine if you're working at a job and you're getting paid $8 an hour, and then your boss says, hey, I'm sorry, times are tough, I can only pay you $6 an hour, okay? That's tough. If the school told me that I was gonna lose 20% of my wages, I'd probably go look for another job as soon as I could, because that would be awful to lose 20% of your pay all at once through no fault of your own. It's just across the board. Everybody gets it. Now, the rich guys owning the railroad, do you think they got a 20% cut of their pay? No, they didn't. Now, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Company, if you've ever played Monopoly and you're like, why is one railroad called the BO Railroad? That's dumb. That's the Baltimore.
Body Odor Railroad.
No, it's the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. Okay, that's the BO Railroad. Anyways, but you've never played Monopoly, you're like, why is one called BO
Everybody
Railroad?
wants the Body Odor Railroad.
But it's Baltimore and Ohio. But Baltimore and Ohio, they're the ones that cut their workers' pay by 20%. And so in 1877, a crew in Martinsburg, West Virginia, just gets mad. And they say, we're not going to take this anymore. We're going to go on strike. When you go on strike, that's when workers refuse to work until their demands are met. The idea is that until you give us a raise, we ain't working. And when we're not working, you're not making money. Okay? So the idea behind a strike is to put pressure on the owner of the business, because he's losing money every day, to give in and give you what you want. Now, what can happen in response is the owner can lock you out in what's called a lockout, where the owner refuses to hire people that are in a labor union, or refuses to let them work until they give up. And so a lot of times in strikes, there's a lot of conflict between the strikers and the management, between who's going to give first, who can hurt the most. Because is it going to be that the owner can't take the loss, or is it going to be the workers who can't afford to not work? Are they just going to, who's going to give up and be a scab? Scab is someone who like goes and works while everyone else is on strike, okay? And you know, the picketers, people who are striking, they'll often have a picket line around the business,
Scab.
okay? And when a scab tries to get through the picket line, okay, it can be bad. There's fights and problems that can happen. Now, if you're in a labor union and you are really known for being rowdy, you can get blacklisted, okay? Which is where business owners put you on a list of names that says, do not hire this guy, okay? Mr. Brown over here, he's a labor union activist. He's always going around and stirring up trouble everywhere he goes, okay? I'm going to tell my business friend to not hire him. I'm going to fire him, and I'm going to tell my friends, don't hire Mr. Brown. He's just going to try to get a union started in your business, okay? But the workers at the Martinsburg, West Virginia railroad station, they don't just go on strike and stop working. They take control of the railroads, and like at the junction where lots of different railroads meet, they just pile it up with cars and basically make it clogged up so that no one can use it. And the thing about railroads are, it's not like a car where you can like go off on the ditch and go around somebody. Like when a train is stuck, no other train can go either, okay? All right, and so this was a railway line that they basically clogged up. But it wasn't just in Martinsburg, West Virginia. Pretty soon, more people followed their example. It was what? Two-thirds of the nation's railroad tracks get shut down as other railroad company workers all across the country hear about what's going on in Martinsburg, West Virginia, and they do the same thing. They shut down the railroads all across the country. And when 2/3 of the railroads are shut down in America, that shuts down the economy. Okay, imagine if all of a sudden 2/3 of all the highways in America just got shut down. How long could we make it?
Not long.
Not very long, right? You know, every day there's like trucks coming into Walmart resupplying food, right? You shut down Walmart for a week or two, okay? Like no more new trucks in, you know, all the people in Silver Springs won't know what to do. They'll be fighting over toilet paper and rice and everything. It can get really bad. The economy ground to a halt, okay? And all across the country, people realized that they had power. This is why it's called the Great Upheaval, because workers realized that they could make something happen. Ultimately, the military gets sent in to try to, the military under President Rutherford B. Hayes tries to get sent in to put it down, and eventually it is put down after 12 days. But for 12 days, the whole economy was shut down. Again, this wouldn't happen without new inventions like the telegram and telephone. Well, telephone's not around at this point, but telegram allows for a lot of this the news to spread. But workers all across the country do what they can to get a change in America. This strike actually led to 100 people dying, okay, as different fights and squabbles as they're trying to put down force the workers to clear the trains off, force the workers to go back to work, okay, and $10 million worth of railroad property was put in rubble, okay. So the Great Upheaval was a big change in America, and after this, there's more and more tensions between labor and management in different parts of the country. Yes?
Didn't the economy shut down like 2 years ago, like last year?
Talking about the government shutdown or?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, the government shutdown is a little different. See, the government has to have a budget, right? They have to pass, and they pass budget laws that say like, this is how we're gonna spend money, this is where we're gonna get money from. Sometimes the people in government can't agree on what the budget should be, and if they can't do that, then the government like temporarily shuts down. Now, what it meant by temporarily shutting down meant that some things got shut down, but not everything got shut down. It was only, basically, it's like not paying your power bill and the lights go off. You know, like they didn't pay for things, so like they couldn't put people to work. Now, our economy shut down really thoroughly back during the early days of the coronavirus, you know, and in a way that's kind of like what happened in the Great Upheaval, but the Great Upheaval was, I think, much more sudden and over much more quickly. Another question? Yes. So after the Great Upheaval, there's continued strikes back and forth across America between labor and management. And the Knights of Labor, they are pretty popular. They have lots and lots of members. But in 1886, there is an explosion that happens in Chicago, okay? In the Haymarket Square of Chicago, there's a crowd of protesters protesting, you know, bad working conditions across the country. And specifically, they were protesting the killing of workers by police at the McCormick Harvester Company, which is a company that made like essentially things like tractors, okay? It was a rainy day. There was a small crowd and police armed with billy clubs and pistols ordered everyone out of the square. And during the protest, an anarchist group threw a bomb into the crowd and it goes off. Okay, there's the bomb.
They didn't have YouTube, but they don't have big bombs.
So books, I suppose, and learning from other people that have done it. 5 people are killed, or 1 officer was killed, 5 others were mortally wounded. And after the bomb goes off, the police opened fire. The crowd fired back. And before the whole thing was over, 70 policemen were injured and at least 4 civilians died. Okay? Now, The person that threw the bomb is not really known, okay? But what happens because of the Haymarket Square incident and the violence associated with it is that public opinion, a lot of people that are kind of on the fence, that don't really know which way they support or other, they turn against the labor union groups like the Knights of Labor. And so the Knights of Labor kind of fizzles out. And we don't have time to tell like the whole story, but the Knights of Labor doesn't survive in all its glory for long term, okay? But the American Federation of Labor does, and it's still around even today. The American Federation of Labor is different from the Knights of Labor, okay? It is led, and it's also known as the AFL. The AFL, the American Federation of Labor, is led by a guy named Samuel Gompers. Samuel Gompers believed that the Knights of Labor had too much going on. They were trying to get too much done. They were trying to get too much reform done. They let too many people in, and they had lost their focus. Samuel Gompers believed in keeping it simple. What do workers care about? They care about money, and they care about working conditions. Bread and butter issues. Bread and butter. That's what workers care about. Workers don't care about, a federal law to nationalize the railroad system or the telegram system or all these different complicated things. The American Federation of Labor says workers want better wages and better conditions. And the best way to do that is to use strikes to get owners to change their business practices. Not to get the government to force businesses to change, but for workers themselves to force businesses to change, okay? So not to get the government involved, but between the workers and the management, get things changed. And so Samuel Gompers, he formed the American Federation of Labor. The American Federation of Labor becomes much more popular, and by 1890, the Knights of Labor is pretty much gone. But Samuel Gompers, his labor union is only skilled workers. Skilled workers, okay? By focusing on skilled workers, he could have greater respectability and he could have greater unity among his union, okay? Now, he wanted highly skilled craft workers, okay? They're difficult to replace. And what he wants is gradual, concrete changes. He doesn't want to change like everything all at once. He wants to go one by one, okay? Change one business at a time. He wants to change one business at a time, and he wants more money, and he wants better working conditions, okay? And so the American Federation of Labor is much more effective than the Knights of Labor for these reasons, okay? They focus, okay? By 1901, it had more than 1 million members, and almost a third of all skilled workers in America were in the American Federation of Labor. The American Federation of Labor led thousands of strikes across America. And while they were not always successful, they had probably one of the highest success rates. I believe in another one of my textbooks, it says about 1 out of every 2, like about half of all the strikes that he did ended up successfully getting better workers and better pay and better conditions for workers. But it's really only for skilled workers, okay? Unskilled workers, they're not welcome because they're seen as the rabble. They're seen as the bomb throwers, the people that are causing trouble, okay? Samuel Gompers, he wants his labor union to be very respectable, okay? So a lot of his work continues even today to get workers better pay and better conditions. Today, the American Federation of Labor merged with another group called the Congress of Industrial Organizers, I believe, and it's still around as probably the largest union in the world, the AFL-CIO. You may have heard of that. It's still around today. It's one of the biggest unions in the world, if not the biggest one in the world today. And so it's still around, okay? And it didn't have as many goals as the Knights of Labor did, but it was much more successful in achieving them. Sometimes you shoot for them, they say, shoot for the moon, and if you miss, you'll land in the stars. That's like, that they put that on like coffee cups so that you can look at it when you just can't even. And then it helps you like be encouraged too even, okay? But in reality, the way that you eat an elephant is one bite at a time, okay? All right, you do it one bite at a time, and you have manageable, concrete goals. You do one thing at a time, and then things will gradually get better. You know, having a much more realistic goal is a lot easier to achieve, because in active labor, they want like super wonderful, everything great ever, and they can't get it. They're like, everybody can join, and we'll get everything we want, but it doesn't work. Keep it simple. Worked much better for Samuel Gompers. Okay?
I can't imagine you ever being sad.
Well, it's happened
When?
all the time.
I'm sorry.
All right, so.
Gosh.
I do get sad from time to time, but every day. No, every day. No, I'm happy. Try that. All right, so listen. Radicals. Let's talk about radicals, okay? The most radical labor groups were the socialists, okay? Socialists, like that boy right there on the left, Eugene V. Debs, socialists, they are not necessarily just a specific union. Eugene V. Debs was the leader of like the American Railway Union, but socialists tended to have universal membership. Anybody can join, okay? But their goal is not to reform the economy. Their goal is to completely and totally change America, to create socialism. Eugene V. Debs, he is probably the most famous socialist in American history. He ran for president like 5 or 6 times, lost every time, but a few times he had a lot of people vote for him. Like he had a few million people vote for him. It was actually fairly popular, so the Socialist Party back around the turn of the century. One time he got arrested and was thrown in jail, and he ran for president from jail, okay, which you can actually do. He did not win, but he did run for president. He got people voted for him, not like everybody, but like a few million over the course of his time running for president. Eugene V. Debs wanted socialism. Socialism is when the government owns the means of production, okay? Government owns the means of production. But people have private property, okay? So the means of production are the things that make other things, like factories, like electric power plants, etc. Okay? In a socialist society, you get to own like your own house and your own stuff, but most of the major businesses are owned by the government and run and operated by the government. This is a very inefficient system in reality. And when you see countries that are socialist, like really socialist, not just pretend socialist, they tend to have a lot of problems, like Venezuela, where they like the government can't manage their supplies for their whole country. It's bad. Okay, most of the countries that have tried socialism, it doesn't work. But on paper, it seems like a nice idea because the government owning the means of production means that people are going to be paid equally, everyone's going to get their fair share, etc. Eugene V. Debs, he was a leader of the Socialist Party. Another socialist labor union was the Industrial Workers of the World. And you can see their little poster on the left or on the right of the screen. The Industrial Workers of the World, or the IWW, they were an international union. They wanted all the workers of the world to unite. And in many ways, these are predecessors to communism. Communism is like socialism, but the government owns everything, including your private property. And everything is shared among the people, however the government decides to share it. But the IWW, they were also called the Wobblies. That was like their nickname. And they basically wanted one big labor union all across the world to, overthrow capitalism. If all the workers get together, they can kill all the capitalists and take over. And that's the thing, those are things that happen in places like Russia where they have a communist revolution, where the workers take over and they install communism. Okay. So there were some people that wanted communism to come into America. And there were people that weren't quite some people wanted full-on revolution. But Eugene V. Debs, he wanted America to change very radically. Now, he was not, they were in the very, very minority, but there are some people so frustrated with the system of the factories and the capitalism America that they were willing to give this guy a chance. Okay. Now, eventually we learned that communism is a really bad thing, especially when we have to deal with Russia and when they become communist. But to sum it up, when we talk about work in factories in America, there is a fight going on between workers and management. But overall, the whole country transforms during the Gilded Age. We have a very, very large increase in our wealth as a nation as a whole, in our technology, and the overall standard of living improves, okay? And when we look at our station compared to the rest of the world, if you look at one of the themes of this class is the growing prominence of the United States as a world power. This is the moment where we really start stretching our legs, okay? So in this graph, we have relative share of world manufacturing output 1750 to 1900. The top one is the UK. Great Britain, they took the lead early on. Then we have Germany, then we have France, then we have like the Habsburg Empire, which I believe is like Austria, Russia, Italy, Japan, and then we have the United States. And you see, 1750, we haven't gotten really barely anything going on. And for most of the first part of the 1800s, there's not much. But after the Civil War, it just skyrockets. And you see by the 1880s, 1890s, and 1900s, we are outpacing the United Kingdom, okay? Right? We are becoming the industrial power of the world in the Gilded Age. And there's a lot of growing pains and there's a lot of struggle, but this is changing. And America becomes basically the most powerful economy in the world by the turn of the century. By the time you get to the year 1920, it's not a contest anymore. We're the biggest manufacturing country of all, okay? Even to this day, while we have fierce competition from countries like China, America has some of the most impressive manufacturing in the world. And we have a lot of economic power that is really, really impressive. And we got our start during the Gilded Age, okay? Wasn't that fun to live during the Gilded Age? But as for our country as a whole, if like, again, it's like the gold covered turd. When you look at it from far away, it's a good period of time. Like America like rose. Like when you look at it on a graph, it's like, this is awesome. When you look at all the inventions, all like the really rich, fancy people and all the things they do, like this is great. But then when like you live there and you go zoom in, then you start to see the nasty problems, okay? So with that, we finish this chapter. So we're only one day behind. So tomorrow, we should be able to start the chapter that we start for this week. So we'll start learning about life in the city. People are